To set up an ambush, 4 Curtiss P-40 Warhawks dove 10,000 feet over the coast of New Guinea. Their target was a silver-gray Aichi-D, 3 Type 99 Val-dive bomber. First Lieutenant Donald S. Lee, Jr., the flight leader, locked the Japanese aircraft in his gun sight and fired a long burst of .50 caliber rounds. At that moment, he felt a strong impact. His plane had been hit in the radiator by a 7.7 millimeter round from the Val's rear gunner. Lee veered away and watched as the engine temperature began to rise rapidly. His wingman later said he saw a thin white mist trailing from the damaged Warhawk, showing that the coolant was leaking fast. Lee realized his aircraft would not make it back. At just 23 years old, Lee calmly considered his odds of surviving in the perilous waters off Cape Ward Hunt. The risks were high. Even if he survived the jump, there were enemy patrol boats and dangerous sharks in the area. There was no guarantee a friendly rescue team would reach him in time. As he unbuckled his safety harness and climbed onto the wing, he tried to push those thoughts aside. But the plane suddenly rolled, slamming him into the rudder and sending him falling toward the sea, only 800 feet below. In the history of the 49th Fighter Group of the United States Army Air Forces, this event on July 14, 1943, was just a small footnote. The Fighting 49ers had been deployed quickly to defend Australia and New Guinea, facing experienced Japanese pilots flying fast, deadly aircraft in a rugged theater of war. Over 3 years, the 49th Fighter Group claimed 668 enemy aircraft shot down. The group included notable pilots like Colonel Gerald R. Johnson, who scored all 22 of his kills with them, and Major Richard I. Bong, America's top ace with 40 victories, 21 of which he earned while flying with the unit. But beyond the famous names, many brave pilots flew difficult missions with worn-out planes over hostile land. One of them was Lieutenant Donald Lee. He served 18 grueling months with the 49th Fighter Group before he was forced to crash land off New Guinea's northern coast. Lee flew more than 600 combat hours in the P-40 Warhawk. He had been part of the action from the start, when skilled Japanese pilots flying the Mitsubishi Zero clashed with inexperienced American pilots over the Australian port of Darwin. Throughout his service, Lee played a crucial role in helping General Douglas MacArthur's forces by intercepting Mitsubishi G-4M Betty bombers, strafing enemy troops, and escorting countless Allied supply planes. During that time, he won 4 air-to-air combat victories. His story is filled with courage, perseverance, and both fortune and misfortune. Donald Harwood Lee, Jr. was born on June 29, 1920, in Ypsilanti, Michigan, to Donald and Hazel Estelle Lee. After graduating from Ypsilanti High School in 1938, he studied architecture for 2 years at the University of Michigan. But his life took a different path. Like many young men of his time, Don dreamed of flying. The Aviation Cadet Training Program offered a 7-month course for young men with 2 years of college and who passed strict physical tests. Though many washed out, those who succeeded were commissioned as second lieutenants in the Army Air Corps, which became the Army Air Forces in June 1941 and received their pilot wings. For Lee, a smart and athletic man from a town with limited opportunities, the idea of joining the cadet program was appealing. Everyone who followed the news knew that the United States was heading toward war. On April 28, 1941, he enlisted in the Army in Detroit, Michigan. Don received advanced flight training on the North American AT-6A Texan, a 2-seat trainer, at Ellington Field near Houston, Texas. He practiced night flying, air navigation, and formation maneuvers under the guidance of USAAF instructors. On October 28th, he ground-looped an AT-6A after a rough landing that caused the aircraft to dig a wing into the grass and spin. Despite this mishap, he earned his pilot wings. Just 4 days after the United States declared war on Japan, on December 12, 1941, Second Lieutenant Donald Lee graduated from flight school and was commissioned into the U.S. Army Air Forces, but there was no time to celebrate. He was quickly sent to Morrison Field near West Palm Beach, Florida. He reported there on December 21st and was assigned to the 7th Pursuit Squadron, one of 3 squadrons in the 49th Pursuit Group. The others were the 8th and 9th Pursuit Squadrons. When the unit received deployment orders on December 26th, the rumors about going overseas turned out to be true. The chaos that followed must have left Lee and his fellow squadron members feeling confused and unsettled. The 49ers quickly gathered all their equipment and personal belongings and boarded a troop train that departed West Palm Beach at 11:45 p.m. Soon after, Japanese supply and troop convoys began nightly runs through the narrow channel between the Solomon Islands. The Americans named these runs the Tokyo Express. Admiral Yamamoto was confident the Marines would surrender by the end of August. A major offensive, Operation C, was launched on August 16th. A regiment of more than 1,400 Army troops, along with Marines, left Truk in the Caroline Islands bound for Guadalcanal. 3 slow transport ships carried the troops and were protected by cruisers and destroyers. A naval task force left Truk 5 days later, at the core of which were the carriers Shokaku and Zuikaku, veterans of Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea, and the light carrier Ryujo. The Japanese plan was to use aircraft from these carriers to destroy any American carriers in the Guadalcanal area. After that, Japanese cruisers and destroyers would wipe out the remaining American surface ships. With American naval and air support neutralized, Japanese troops would land on August 24th. They expected to regain control of Guadalcanal and its airfield by September. Allied forces in the Solomon Islands were alert for signs of a major Japanese offensive. Vice Admiral Robert L. Gormley, commander of American forces in the South Pacific, ordered Task Force 16 to protect Guadalcanal and nearby sea lanes. The carrier USS Hornet and her escorts left Pearl Harbor on August 17th, and the battleships Washington and South Dakota left the U.S. East Coast for the Pacific. Admiral Gormley wanted to be ready, but he first needed good reconnaissance to locate the approaching Japanese forces. Both American and Japanese fleets moved toward Guadalcanal, aware that enemy warships were in the area, but lacking precise intelligence. Neither Admiral Yamamoto nor Admiral Gormley knew the exact locations or strength of their opponent's forces. On the morning of August 23rd, a U.S. Navy Catalina flying boat finally spotted the Japanese troop transports heading southeast toward Guadalcanal. However, the Japanese carriers and other warships remained undetected. An airstrike was quickly planned. Saratoga launched 37 bombers and torpedo planes, and Henderson Field added 23 land-based aircraft an hour and a half later. But Rear Admiral Reizo Tanaka, commanding the Japanese transports and escorts, changed course when he realized his ships had been seen. He turned northwest toward Truk, keeping the transports out of American bomber range. When Saratoga's planes arrived, they found only open ocean. The planes from Henderson Field had no better luck. Vice Admiral Frank J. Fletcher, commander of Task Force 16, still didn't know where the enemy carriers were or how many there might be. He also had a logistical concern. His carriers escorting destroyers were running low on fuel. Since he lacked information about Japanese carriers, Fletcher decided to detach the carrier Wasp and send it south to refuel, a trip that would take 2 days. He was later criticized for this decision because it reduced his available air power by 16 aircraft, 1/3 of his total carrier strength, just before battle. Throughout the night of August 23rd, the two forces drew closer. Tanaka's transport group turned again and resumed course for Guadalcanal, still undetected. At 9:35 a.m. on August 24th, a Catalina flying from the Santa Cruz Islands spotted Ryujo and her escorts about 250 miles north of Guadalcanal, moving south. Although the battle hadn't started, both sides had already made errors. Fletcher's detachment of Wasp proved unnecessary. Logs from all 7 U.S. destroyers showed they had enough fuel to continue. Fletcher, cautious by nature and more experienced with cruisers than carriers, revealed his inexperience in carrier operations with this decision. On the Japanese side, Admiral Chuichi Nagumo made a similar mistake. He ordered Ryujo to separate from the main fleet and launch an airstrike on Henderson Field instead of saving her aircraft to strike U.S. carriers. This move may have been intended as a distraction, similar to tactics used at Coral Sea. Back then, the light carrier Shoho had drawn American attention away from the main fleet. Although Shoho was sunk, the bigger Japanese carriers escaped detection, until later. Some criticized Admiral Yamamoto for risking major carriers to defend what seemed like a small landing operation. But within the Japanese high command, Yamamoto didn't see it as minor. Known for his love of gambling, bridge and poker included, he was willing to take calculated risks. While Yamamoto and Nagumo were making bold moves, Fletcher remained cautious. Even after learning Ryujo's location, he delayed an attack, suspecting other Japanese carriers were nearby, though he lacked solid evidence. He remembered that Shoho had once served as bait. Finally, at 1:40 p.m., Fletcher ordered an airstrike from Saratoga. The strike force included 30 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers and 8 Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers. Meanwhile, Ryujo had already launched her own airstrike. 6 Nakajima Kate bombers escorted by 15 Mitsubishi Zero fighters, targeting Henderson Field. These aircraft were supposed to meet up with 24 twin-engine Mitsubishi Betty bombers and 14 more Zeros from Rabaul, but bad weather forced the land-based planes to turn back. Ryujo's aircraft reached Guadalcanal at 1:20 p.m., where Marine Wildcat fighters were ready. In the ensuing dogfight, the Marines lost 3 Wildcats and 2 pilots, while the Japanese lost 3 Zeros and 4 Kates. Surviving Zero pilots claimed they shot down 15 Wildcats, but the actual damage to Henderson Field was minor and quickly repaired. About an hour later, Saratoga's strike group reached Ryujo. Commander Harry D. Felt led the attack and concentrated all dive bombers on the carrier. One by one, the bombers dove from 14,000 feet, leveling out at 1,800 feet to release their bombs. Felt scored a direct hit, but only 2 more bombs struck the carrier. After their dives, the American planes encountered 7 Zeros, but all managed to evade the enemy fighters. None of the bombers were shot down, despite Japanese claims that 8 had been destroyed. After the dive bombers made their escape, the Avengers under Lieutenant Bruce L. Harwood began their attack. The torpedo pilots used anvil tactics, splitting into groups and attacking from both sides of the target so that the carrier would expose its full side to one of them, regardless of its direction. Although smoke from earlier bomb damage made the carrier Ryujo hard to see at times, 6 torpedo bombers managed to hit it with 1 torpedo. Commander Felt observed the attack from scattered clouds and noted that Ryujo was maneuvering in tight circles like a water bug to evade the American planes. After he departed the area, the carrier came to a complete stop, listing 20 degrees to starboard. Around 8 p.m. it rolled over and sank. Most of the crew were rescued by the cruiser Tone, while American airmen who splashed down nearby were picked up by Ryujo's destroyers. Fletcher was relieved to hear that an enemy carrier had been knocked out, though he wasn't completely certain Ryujo had sunk, as Commander Felt's group returned to Saratoga before the carrier capsized. Naval intelligence wouldn't confirm Ryujo's loss until 1943. Soon after, Fletcher received reports from a PBY and search planes from Enterprise that 2 other Japanese carriers had been spotted northeast of Ryujo. 1/3 of Fletcher's carrier force had already been committed in the attack. Another third was diverted southward with its destroyers, leaving only the Enterprise air group available. At 12:40 p.m., 16 dive bombers and 7 torpedo bombers were sent out on a patrol, eventually locating Shokaku and Zuikaku around 2:10 p.m. Aboard Enterprise, only 7 Wildcat fighters, 11 dive bombers, and 7 torpedo bombers remained. At 4:30 p.m., Enterprise's radar picked up incoming enemy aircraft on a bearing of 320 degrees, 88 miles away and closing. Radar in 1942 was primitive. It couldn't detect altitude, and the radar blips lasted just seconds. After some quick calculations, the enemy was estimated to be flying at 12,000 feet. Enterprise and Saratoga launched 53 Wildcats to intercept. Meanwhile, on Saratoga's flight deck, 5 Avenger and 2 Dauntless pilots were preparing their aircraft when they heard a strange loudspeaker order instructing them to take off immediately, join Enterprise's group, and attack any enemy ships they could find. They followed the vague order, although no one had proper flight or navigation gear except for one pilot who had a chart. At 4:49 p.m., the enemy aircraft reappeared on radar, now only 44 miles away. 4 sections of Wildcats, usually 4 fighters each, stopped orbiting the fleet and headed out to intercept. Lieutenant A.O. Voris of Enterprise received his orders and climbed to 10,000 feet. Above him, he could see 2 formations of enemy planes, each with about 18 dive bombers and fighter escorts. At 4:55 p.m., from 20,000 feet, Voris shouted "Tally-ho" into his radio and dove on the enemy. As they descended, Wildcats engaged Zero fighters. Voris attacked a Zero, setting it on fire. 2 other pilots also downed Zeros. Ensign Francis Register claimed to have shot down a German-made plane. The group, low on fuel, headed for Saratoga. Voris, out of fuel and ammunition, made a smooth landing in the carrier's wake and was picked up by a destroyer. The group had performed well, though engaging fighters wasn't their primary mission. Reaching the dive bombers proved harder than expected. Machinist Donald Runyon from Enterprise successfully used the sun to his advantage. In his first attack, hidden by the glare, he shot down a Val dive bomber. Climbing again, he used the same tactic to take down a second. On his third approach, tracers from a Zero zipped past his cockpit. He maneuvered and turned the tables, shooting down the Zero. Below him, he found another Val and shot it down in a smoking turn. An escorting Zero dove after him, but he pulled up and fired again. This time, the Zero didn't explode, but flew off trailing smoke. In 5 minutes, Runyon had shot down 3 Vals, a Zero, and damaged another Zero. Meanwhile, other Wildcats from Enterprise and Saratoga were also attacking the incoming planes. SBD dive bomber pilots returning from the Ryujo strike also encountered enemy planes. Lieutenant Sander L.G. Kern and his group of 10 dive bombers spotted 4 Vals flying low. Though not trained for dogfighting, the bomber crews attacked in single file, using their forward guns and then opening fire from rear gunners as they passed beneath the enemy. 3 of the 4 Vals were shot down and 1 was damaged. While the fighter screen engaged the attackers, U.S. ships prepared to defend themselves. Enterprise steamed southeast at 27 knots, escorted by the battleship North Carolina, 2 cruisers, and 6 destroyers. At 4:42 p.m., Enterprise's radar reported that the enemy planes were directly overhead. Despite the efforts of the fighter screen and Kern's dive bombers, about 25 enemy planes made it through. Although the original Japanese plan was to split their attack between Enterprise and Saratoga, the surviving Vals all concentrated on Enterprise. Captain Arthur C. Davis, watching from the bridge, was impressed by the enemy's skill and determination. The cruiser Portland's gunnery officer was less impressed, calling the enemy pretty good. Anti-aircraft guns around Enterprise opened up, described by one observer as a steel umbrella and another as a cloud of fire. 8 Vals broke off to attack North Carolina, missing the battleship but dropping a bomb nearby. 9 dive bombers were shot down, most by Enterprise's own gunners. Aboard the ship, crew members watched as one bomber approached closely enough to make out its bomb before it released it. The bomb landed in the water and failed to explode. Captain Davis ordered evasive maneuvers, turning the carrier sharply. Despite the chaos, the dive bombers continued their attack in 7-second intervals. 3 were blown apart by 5-inch shell bursts, and several bombs landed near the ship, dousing the deck with seawater. At 4:44 p.m., one bomb hit the flight deck, crashing through the corner of the aft elevator and detonating after penetrating 3 decks. The blast rocked the long carrier, knocking men off their feet. Gunners were thrown from their stations, disrupting the anti-aircraft barrage. The deck now had a twisted bulge and a gaping hole. The elevator was out of service, and several fires broke out. 35 men were killed instantly. A ruptured water main helped extinguish one of the larger fires. Just 30 seconds later, a second bomb hit, landing within 15 feet of the first. The carrier shook and vibrated as all the 5-inch guns on the starboard quarter were destroyed. Their crews were killed when 40 rounds of powder exploded. The Enterprise listed slightly to starboard, and thick smoke poured from 2 holes in the flight deck. Despite this, she maintained a steady speed of 27 knots. Damage control crews quickly began fighting fires, plugging leaks, and restoring power. Within minutes of the second bomb hit, pharmacist mates treated 95 wounded men before transferring them to sick bay. Only one of those men later died from his injuries. 3 minutes after the first bomb struck, Enterprise was hit a third time near elevator number 2 and just aft of the island. This 500-pound bomb was defective, resulting in a low-order explosion. Still, it blew a 10-foot hole in the flight deck, damaged more anti-aircraft guns, and disabled the elevator. By 4:45 p.m., the last of the enemy dive bombers flew off to the northeast, chased by several Wildcats. Enterprise, though heavily damaged and trailing black smoke, continued at 24 knots and reported to the fleet that she did not need assistance. An hour after the third bomb hit, Enterprise began recovering aircraft. By 6:21, 25 planes were back on board. As the 26th plane approached, the carrier unexpectedly turned to port. The pilot was waved off and flew away with landing gear down and arrestor hook deployed. The turn was unintentional. One of the bombs had knocked out the ship's steering gear by flooding the compartment housing the electric rudder motor. The rudder jammed hard right, and the ship kept turning to starboard, nearly colliding with the destroyer Booch. With the rudder stuck, Enterprise couldn't even be towed. Captain Davis slowed the ship to 10 knots, while repair crews worked to regain control. Several men tried to activate the standby motor but were overcome by 170 degrees Fahrenheit heat. Eventually, Chief Machinist William A. Smith, the ship's steering motor expert, managed to switch to the backup motor, after twice passing out from the heat. Steering was restored at 6:39, and Enterprise straightened out on a southern course. During Smith's repair efforts, radar picked up an incoming group. 30 more enemy dive bombers from Shokaku and Zuikaku were on their way. The planes appeared about 50 miles away and then veered south. With no American fighters available to intercept, low on fuel and ammunition, the blip reversed and disappeared. Enterprise had been given an unexpected reprieve. The strike leader had been given Enterprise's estimated position before takeoff, and a more accurate update was sent while they were airborne. But the radio operator failed to copy it properly. Ironically, the absence of American fighters helped. The Japanese, seeing no opposition and low on fuel, turned back. Enterprise had a reputation for good luck, and it seemed to hold that day. But her pilots were not so fortunate. They had intended to join forces with Saratoga's aircraft, but neither group could find the enemy or each other. Saratoga's planes did manage to damage the seaplane tender Choshu with 2 near misses that caused flooding. After an unsuccessful search for Shokaku and Zuikaku, 11 Enterprise dive bombers chose to land at Henderson Field, rather than attempt to find their carrier in the dark. Avenger pilots had more fuel and kept flying. One spotted what appeared to be fast-moving warships in the fading light. The torpedo planes dove to attack, but the wakes turned out to be waves breaking over Roncador Reef, 100 miles north of Santa Isabel Island. The pilots dropped their torpedoes and tried to find Enterprise. Only one made it back safely. Another crashed into the carrier's island structure, blocking the flight deck and forcing the rest to land on Saratoga. By 10 p.m., all aircraft that would return, American and Japanese, had either made it back to their carriers or landed at Guadalcanal. Rear Admiral Fletcher decided to withdraw to the south. Enterprise was badly damaged, and he did not want to risk a night battle. Meanwhile, the Japanese advance force had already set a course to intercept the Americans, but by midnight, seeing no sign of U.S. ships, they turned back. Admiral Tanaka's transport group remained intact and continued toward Guadalcanal. At 2:33 a.m. on August 25th, a PBY Catalina spotted the convoy and relayed its position. At about 6 a.m., 8 SBDs, escorted by 8 Wildcats, launched from Henderson Field to search for the 2 Japanese carriers, but found nothing. When the Wildcats ran low on fuel, they returned. The SBDs continued without fighter cover and stumbled upon Tanaka's transports. Japanese lookouts mistook the bombers for friendly planes. Tanaka's flagship, the light cruiser Jinsu, was the first to be attacked. After several near misses, one bomb hit squarely between her forward turrets, flooding the magazine, damaging the hull, and knocking Tanaka unconscious. Another bomb set the transport Kinryu Maru on fire. A third near miss damaged Boston Maru. After pulling out of their dives, SBD gunners claimed to have shot down 2 Japanese float planes. Around 10:15 a.m., 8 B-17 Flying Fortress bombers appeared. The destroyer Matsuki, aiding the damaged Kinryu Maru, was hit in the engine room and sank. Her captain, pulled from the water, muttered that even the B-17s could make a hit once in a while. Another destroyer, Yuzuki, was sprayed with shrapnel. The destroyer Mochizuki scuttled the burning Kinryu Maru with a torpedo. By then, Japanese headquarters canceled the planned operation. Losses from the previous day, followed by the morning's air attacks, convinced them to abandon the landing. Admiral Tanaka, now aboard the destroyer Kagero, was ordered to withdraw to Faisi Harbor in the Shortland Islands. According to historian Richard B. Frank, the Battle of the Eastern Solomons was clearly an American victory. The U.S. lost fewer aircraft and men, 25 planes and 8 crew members. Enterprise, though heavily damaged, would return to Pearl Harbor for repairs and be out of action for at least 2 months. Japan lost 3 ships, Ryujo, Matsuki, and Kinryu Maru, along with 75 aircraft and their skilled crews, losses they could not easily replace. Tanaka's convoy turned back because the carrier air groups had been badly mauled, making a daylight landing too risky. The remaining troops were loaded onto destroyers for a night run, landing without heavy equipment 3 nights later.